So welcome everyone to today's webinar, From Slavery to Mass Incarceration. This is the second in a three-part series on prosecutors and mass incarceration presented in collaboration by ChangeLawyers and for the people. My name is Carlos. I use he and they pronouns, and I am the Chief Content Director at ChangeLawyers. For those of you who are unfamiliar, ChangeLawyers is a legal foundation, and our mission is to fund the next generation of change makers. Now, before we begin today, I do want to acknowledge that we are less than a week away from the election, and so I want to just send my love out to everyone joining us today. I know it's been a stressful year. As of 2020, hasn't already been more than overwhelming. And I know that I personally, at various points, have felt very much overwhelmed. And yet, I remain very grateful for this room, everyone in this room, and the space that we are about to create together. And so with that in mind, I do want to set some intentions and sort of guidelines for the discussion. Just like every space that ChangeLawyers hosts, we in this space, we will value your honesty and your vulnerability and your emotions. And above all else, we're going to value your identities. And so as we embark on this next hour, I invite all of you to share as much as you're comfortable, to be as vulnerable as you're comfortable in the comments, in the chat box and in the Q&A box. And at the end of the hour, we're gonna have some Q&A time, and we'll be pulling questions from what you all drop in the chat box and the Q&A box. And one thing to keep in mind is that this series is explicitly meant to center the experiences of Black and Brown folks. And so if you are not that, just be mindful of how much space you take in the comments section. And I do want to give a shout out today. Like I said, this is the second in a three-part series that was co-developed with Hillary Blount. And she runs an incredible organization called For the People. It's a Black woman-led and founded organization. And so a little bit about Hillary. So she is the executive director of For the People. They are a newly launched organization that supports prosecutors in reevaluating past sentences and facilitating release of incarcerated people who are serving unjust sentences. They target hard to reach populations. They focus on those who are serving very, very long sentences or people who are serving sentences involving serious and violent offenses. And we at ChangeLawyers are just so just like we consider ourselves so lucky that there's someone like Hillary doing this work and that we can just like provide some support for that. So this past summer, Hillary had two ChangeLawyers fellows working with her to do this work. And I've talked to both of them and they've both are just sort of, they're law students and they're so overwhelmed and happy to have had that space and that experience. And the rest of the panelists are very impressive, definitely sort of social justice heroes, starting with Sam Lewis. Sam is the executive director of the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. Previously, he was also the director of Inside Programs at ARC. Sam is a former life prisoner himself, and so he understands the various obstacles, challenges, and difficulties that folks face when they try to re-enter society after being in prison. In 2017, Sam created the Hope and Redemption Team, a first of its kind initiative he built from scratch. It is a team of 9 former California life prisoners who go back into California state prisons to provide hope, to demonstrate that redemption is possible and achievable, and to prepare people for successful life in reentry. And our second panelist is Jamie Hodge from the Viera Institute of Justice. She is a director at Viera. She is the director of Reshaping Prosecution Program. She joined Viera in April 2018 after serving for 12 years as the Assistant United States Attorney in Washington, D.C. And during that time when she was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, Jamie handled both local and federal crimes and tried more than 30 cases. And so with that, I just want to bring all our folks, all our panelists on video. And Hillary, go ahead and take it over.
Thank you, Carlos. And thank you so much, ChangeLawyers, for creating this space and this platform to have these three separate but related conversations about our criminal justice system. And so, as you said, earlier this week, we talked about prosecutors and trying to kind of highlight for folks the incredible power that prosecutors hold in the justice system. We're going to be talking post-election and get real specific about some of the things that prosecutors can do to show up for Black and brown lives in this country. But we wanted to have this conversation because it is important to be able to figure out exactly how we got here. Now, I know that some people will say, well, let's just keep it moving. And, it's not really about how we got here. It's really more about where we're going. And I have to say, personally, as a former prosecutor, I did not know then what I know now about the connections between slavery and our current modern criminal justice system. And for me, when I was able to make that connection, I had, experts like we have here today, Sam and Jami, other movement leaders and grassroots leaders that really just schooled me on a lot of my own blind spots. And once those connections were made for me, my commitment and resolve has just become that much more deep. And I think that when people here today are also able to hear this, and it's a lot to hold, I'll just name that. I know that I see in the chat that there are career prosecutors that have joined today's conversation, and it's a lot. And we're going to kind of unpack that a little bit, because I think that when this conversation comes up, the natural reaction to prosecutors is, but I'm not a racist. And so we really want to try to make the connections clear and then turn towards how we take this information and what we do with it. So, hang on tight. We're going to take you there. And so I wanted to start, obviously, with Jami, as I said at the last session, hashtag Black Women Lead, hashtag Listen to Black Women. So we're going to start with you, Jami. Now, this is your body of work, and you and other experts have said that the connection to slavery is real. And so with 2.3 million people in this country under some type of correctional control, and so by that I mean prison, jail, parole, probation, everywhere you look, Black and brown people are overrepresented. So I want to turn to you to help us understand how we got here and help us understand this argument and help us connect the dots.
Thank you, Hillary. I am so excited to be here and excited for this conversation. And before jumping in there, I want to touch on the point you just raised about how this can be hard to hear. And I want to just do a little bit of framing so that, it's so important that we try to come into this conversation with open hearts and open minds and really from a position of being able to learn. And so I want to do what I can right now to dispel any myths that this conversation is about calling people racist. And I think the best way to do that is to really talk about, how, and often when we talk about this issue and when we do trainings, we use an analogy of a car. And so, if you think about, the best driver you can think of out there. So Danica Patrick, if you put her in, the 1912 Ford Model T, and you put me in a 2020 Porsche, I'm gonna win every time. It doesn't matter how great a driver she is. And so, I want to make sure that we're talking about and that people understand the framings that what we're talking about today is the car, not the drivers. I think you can have the most well-intentioned drivers, again, the best drivers, but when the car, in this case, the system, is fundamentally broken, is fundamentally set up to fail, is fundamentally set up to disparately impact Black and brown people, you can be the most down, conscious, race conscious, for the people person. Because I'll say I took the job as a prosecutor with heightened skepticism and wanting to use some of the power to right some of the wrongs I saw happening in the system. But ultimately, I became part of a system that was still harming folks who look like me. So please understand today, what we're talking about is the car. We are not talking about drivers, we're talking about the system. And so that is why understanding history and how we got here is critically important. I didn't learn any of this stuff either until I stopped being a prosecutor. We're not taught it in law school. We're certainly not taught it in our elementary and high school classes as part of our history. Unfortunately, our history is often whitewashed and many things are left out, and it's often currently being rewritten in ways that try to minimize what happened to Black people in this country. And when we understand first, not just, sort of the horrors behind slavery. I mean, we don't have to go through that. We know that. But what we don't talk about is the direct connection between slavery and what we see now. And so I'm just going to take just a couple minutes to walk through some of that and what do I mean by that. So Brian Stevenson, who many people probably know, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, amazing just movement lawyer, talks often about how slavery wasn't abolished in this country, that slavery evolved. And he points to the 13th Amendment in 1865, which was passed to abolish slavery. If you look at the language of the 13th Amendment, there's a huge exception written into the amendment. It abolished slavery except as punishment for crime for those who are duly convicted. And that exception is what has really been, what the 13th Amendment abolished, again, was the legal status, except for this exception, but it certainly didn't address all of the attitudes, all of the misperceptions, all of the narratives that justified the enslavement of Black people for hundreds of years. So while we had a 13th Amendment that was passed, nothing was done to address all of the thinking of the inferiority, the thinking of the, really violence, that Black people were people that needed to be controlled by white people, that was necessary for safety. None of those narratives were addressed, just the legal status. And so by creating that exception, those narratives just morphed into other ways. And so what the same slaveholders, the same folks who bought into those narratives did was then, fine, we'll create a set of laws that blows that exception wide open, and those were Black codes. And what they did was make it a crime to literally walk at night, to one of them walk without a purpose. If you were found on the street and could not show documentation that you were employed by a white person, you were literally arrested and then leased back out. It was called convict leasing, to the very same plantations that the formerly enslaved had just been freed from. Now, of course, though, it's different. Some say that convict leasing was even harsher than the conditions of slavery, because now the owners have no, before, as property, slaves were money to them. They took loans against enslaved people. They used them to be able to purchase other things. But when you're leasing, you don't care. It's like a rental car. You don't really care. It's not yours. And so they worked those who were leased out to death and would just ask, go back and get some more, So those conditions, some say, were even harsher than slavery. And then we had the 14th Amendment, which brought equal protection. Really, solely the point of it was to abolish the Black codes. And so what did it do? It morphed again. Again, 14th Amendment, we never addressed the underlying narratives or the attitudes or all the thinking that justified what had been happening in this country from the beginning. So not addressing it, not reckoning with it. And so we have the 14th Amendment, and so it evolved to Jim Crow laws. Okay, we can't specifically have Black codes, but we can, push out separate but equal, and still continue to find ways to oppress and control the formerly enslaved Black people. And Civil Rights Act addressed Jim Crow laws. Again, as a country, never addressing the thinking, the narratives, the thoughts and the feelings, the emotions, the things that had existed that justified and had never been dealt with, just legal status. And so it's morphed again. And so understanding and seeing that direct connection. And there's a lot out there. I mean, and you know, the 13th documentary that Ava DuVernay did does an amazing job of walking through this. The 1619 Project. There are so EJI just as a museum. There's so many ways to really go in and learn the history, and there are very explicit examples of how even under Nixon, his domestic policy chief was very clear. There's a quote we put up when we do trainings where it's like, did we know, you know, we were, you know, we needed to be able to control the Blacks and the hippies. And so we criminalized drugs. And that way we could vilify them night after night on the TV. We could arrest them. We could go into their homes. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. You know, they weren't, there's lots of concrete evidence, even around the intentionality behind laws that were passed. We think about the war on drugs. We think about just really basically from the 70s, how we went from a country that was similar to our peers in our levels of incarceration, around 300,000, less than that, people, to what we have now, 2.2 to 2.3 million people who are incarcerated in our country. So it is, the disparities are real. I think anyone who works in the system sees that, but I think understanding that connection, understanding the narrative. So then another interesting piece is and this is Khalil Muhammad's research. He talks a lot about what promoted this narrative of dangerousness for Black people, you know, that there's just an association of dangerousness that comes with Black skin. And the 1890 census was one of the first that sort of looked at the race groups, found that although Black people were like 12% of the population, we were 30% of the incarcerated population. Of course, that was right behind Black codes and vagrancy laws. And so that disparity, those numbers were then put out there to show the dangerousness of Black people, to justify further incarceration of Black people. And so I think it's just important, you know, when you work in a system and you see these disparities, that you have some of that historical context. So I'm gonna stop there because I don't wanna go on too long. I'm happy to drop into the chat a couple of key resources that I think are great at sort of breaking some of this down.
Thank you, Jami. I forgot that I was moderating because I was just listening. I mean, you're exactly right. And packing in what you just said, there's so much more and so many more connections that sort of illustrate everything that you've kind of walked us through. I wanted to turn to you, Sam, and I think that somebody might hear that, what you just walked us through, Jami, and they might say, that was then, but this is now. And so there's not really, yeah, that helps us understand how we got here. That's a great little history lesson. But what does that have to do with practices today? And so, Sam, I want to turn to you and ask you, how does this history and this legacy, how has this affected you? And talk to us a little bit about this notion of cognitive dissidence in our system. You're on mute, friend.
Oh, sorry, Jami. That first of all, Hillary, thank you for inviting me. Jami, on point, just like boom. Let me say one thing, just so everybody understands. The way our system was set up when it began, it's not broken. It's functioning the way it's supposed to function. Like literally, it was meant to empower rich white men, period. No exceptions about that. Not women, not Black people, not Indigenous people, not Latino, rich white men, period. Landowners. And that's how it was set up. And it's been functioning that way, and it still functions that way. For me, how it's impacted me is a couple of things. Like, first of all, understanding what cognitive dissonance is. It's the ability to justify or dehumanize a person. So if I continuously say you're less than a human and base that on your skin color, and this goes all the way back, if you go back and you read the science of anthropology, you'll find that's where it was first established at. And so if you put that out and you say, okay, it's in a book. And so that makes it official. And I went to school and I can show you this. And so it's in a book and I can say that you're less than because you're Black, or you're less than because you're a woman. If I continue to pound that in, people begin to believe it, and that becomes the narrative. And that's been a narrative, and sadly, even in our country today, that's still the narrative. People will say, well, I'm not racist, I'm not, like, stop and think for a minute. And I mean, literally pay attention to some small things, how you interrupt a person, how you interact with a person, and watch others how they do it. And you'll find what people call microaggressions. But for me, personally, how it impacted me is I spent 24 years in prison. And I learned a lot of lessons before going to prison as a kid. I went in as a teenager. And I remember my mom, who grew up in the South in Louisiana, always telling me that you'll have to do twice as good to be accepted. You'll have to work twice as hard, sometimes 3 times as hard to be respected. And I didn't get it as a kid. And then when I went to prison, all of these lessons my mom tried to instill in me flooded back. And what she did, and she understood the necessity of it, she fed me books, historical books. At first, she would send them and she'd ask me to write a few sentences about the book. And then she would want reports. And literally, this is how I really learned about my history, from the 26 dynasties that are documented in Africa, all the way to the slave trade, the Middle Passage, to the first Africans that came to America, which were not slaves originally when we first came, and then enslavement, and then just the training of the mind of people that Black people were less than. And then she taught me about what they call redlining. And I'm like, what redlining? What is that? And she's like, understand how it impacts you if you really want to help people and change things. And as I went through this change from a gang member and dope dealer to a person who understood that I'm meant to be greater than this, I started looking around myself and saying, how did I end up here? And that's where we get into where we're at right now today. So if you can imagine, even right now today, if you go to 105th and Broadway, drive down there and look at what the community looks like. Where are tax dollars at? And just imagine you being a 10, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old kid that comes out and you see this. You don't see resources, you don't see hope, and you go to a school where teachers don't care about you. What is that telling you as a person? And you see all these different things in your community, and so it impacts you in a certain way. And then when you get caught up in our carceral system and you walk into a court and you have this judge that's sitting up on a high bench that's white, and oftentimes for me and many times a prosecutor that's white and a defense attorney that's white that's supposed to help you but that tells you to take a deal, you begin to start believing a certain narrative that's not true, that you're less than, that you're not worthy. And then when you enter the carceral system, it's the same thing. It grinds you down and grinds you down and grinds you down. And you begin to believe this false narrative that you were meant to be here. The system was designed that way. It's working perfectly. So what I learned, because my mom both had the courage, the spirit, and the wisdom to feed me these books and to tell me that you're greater than your circumstances, was I have to turn my life around and I'm in command of my life, and it's going to be a difficult path, but I can do this. Especially if my mom tells me, like, everybody loves their mom. Like, mom said I can do it, I can do it. I've been home now 9 years after spending 24 years in prison. And I know we'll get into more of this, but the work that we've done to change the system is still, it's been almost 10 years I've been doing this. It's still a lot of work to do. A lot of work to do.
Sam, let me follow up with what you just said. A lot of work to do, and I think that the three of us this is our life's work now, is to make the necessary changes to the system. And for me specifically, I am, trying to find people in prison that have the similar redemption story as you, and I'm wondering, what would you say? I mean, there's been a couple comments in the chat already, and something that comes up a lot is that, what about the victims in these cases? And the fact that, what about the fact that so many of our victims are also Black and brown? And we all know that victims aren't necessarily all unified and saying that the DA experience was the best, right? We know that there's issues there too. So Sam, what can you tell us about how, the work that you're doing also allows there to be space to address victims that are also part of our system?
So, so survivors and survivors of violent crime and families that have lost loved ones to violent crime are part of our community, just as the people who committed those crimes and went away to prison, like me. And part of the process is accountability and demonstrating true remorse, because that helps with healing. Now, it's a long journey, but what we believe in at ARC is, one, you have to be accountable. I had to hold myself accountable for my actions. The system held me accountable, but the system is not designed to not just hold you accountable, but help you heal and become the best version of yourself. So that accountability has to come from within. And once you hold yourself accountable, the second piece is understanding, like, this is my community. Let me understand the damage that I've done to my community and understand why. All of those are pieces of accountability and demonstrating remorse. And as you go down that path, you start realizing, like, this is not how I'm supposed to treat my community. This is not how I'm supposed to treat my brothers and sisters that are in the community, my neighbors. And when you take that journey, oftentimes it's scary because you have to look at the worst part of yourself. And then you have to address that. Like, what made me make those decisions? What made me take this journey down this road? And then address those. And oftentimes what we found is those who have victimized were once victimized themselves. And this, not to make an excuse, is literally, if you think, what about 7-year-old Johnny who walked to the liquor store and got jumped by a gang? And now little Johnny he don't know what to do. He goes home, he doesn't say anything. Now he's scared to go to the store, so he doesn't go to the store. Then he goes to school and he gets jumped again. After a while, what will little Johnny do? After a while, he's gonna respond and react. And oftentimes what happens is it escalates, but he was first a victim. And then he becomes even a greater victimizer, so to speak, because of his experience. And so you got to go through all those levels of trauma on the inside, like, and you have to center people who have suffered losses to violent crime and have experienced violent crime, the survivors. And the best way that we found to do this, in conjunction with other organizations, is to bring those survivors into proximity with people who have committed those crimes, so that there can be a dialogue, a healing dialogue. In fact, I'd like to just shout out Healing Dialogues in Action, which is a great organization that does this work and helps heal, because that's where the closure comes from. Like, and it doesn't mean that, like, I commit a crime and I admit it and I get to go free. No, I still have to address my issues. And oftentimes the way to address those issues is, yes, you have to be removed from society in a carceral system, but not the system we have that grinds you down. A system that helps you heal and address the issues that you had in the first place.
Right. I've been able to sit in some of those circles, and so I know exactly what you're referencing, and the power to see a woman who has lost a child, and then somebody who has taken the life of another human being, and the power that comes from those conversations. I want to turn to you, Jami, because you, for several years, right, over a decade, you looked at this. You had a defendant that was a person of color. You had a victim that's a person of color, and your job is to serve. Who are you there to serve, and how are you balancing that reality in the courtroom?
Yeah, I think this question is critically important about the role of survivors, because so much of what we do in our system, we do in the name of justice for victims. So all the punitive approaches, all the ways that we really enact state-sanctioned violence against human beings, we justify that, saying this is how we get justice for victims. It is amazing when we actually, and I will say it as a prosecutor, someone who worked with victims for so many years, I thought, I'm like, oh no, I know what victims want. I've worked closely. They've cried in my office. I've also seen it up close in my own life. My father, while I was in high school, was the victim of a violent robbery that left him with a severe closed head injury. So I know the impact a traumatic crime can have on a person, on a family, and on their loved ones. And so I thought that that's part of my motivation is I do want to work with victims. I want to be helpful to them. I think anyone who has worked in the system has seen up close that nothing we do in our current process actually centers the needs of those who've been harmed. They don't. We have a process where, unfortunately, survivors become a piece of evidence that we need to prove at trial to get a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt, meaning they have to now share their trauma in a very public forum. And we'll try to provide a little bit of support. We have amazing advocates and folks who will try to work with them. But it is all for this goal of getting a conviction. It is not about what do you need to feel safe? What do you need for your healing? What do you need for repair? And then the way the entire process is set up is never to really make the person who caused the harm actually acknowledge it. There's no communication allowed between a defendant and a victim, or defendant and the prosecutor. Even when you have the one time at sentencing, maybe there's a victim impact statement and there's a brief opportunity to say something to each other. But at that point, that that's for a purpose. It's to influence a sentence. It's not about really what happened, giving a person who's been harmed the opportunity to even ask questions and understand, why me? Why did this happen to me? What was, how do I make sure that this doesn't happen to someone else? And so much of the way we function actually doesn't center them, but we say it does. When we look at the data, when we look at surveys of those who experience crime and who've been harmed in our country, less than 50% of victims of violent crime even call the police. So if we just think about, we have this whole system that we do all these awful things to other people, and we say we do it because this is how we get justice for someone who's been harmed. Everything we offer in this system, 50% of the people experiencing harm won't even pick up the phone to engage because they know that there's nothing in that system that is actually going to address what they need. And then even for those, and especially prosecutors know that, who then do get involved and will call the police, less than half of those make it through the process. We've all had the uncooperative person who just is like, I don't want to do this. I'm not going to stand and talk about this in front of a bunch of strangers. Or I've just, I don't think you just sending this person away is actually going to help me, So when we think about what we do, even those who make it all the way, we're talking about a very small subset. And when you talk to those people who actually see the process through, how many of them after the fact say that no, yeah, knowing this person's away, there's some feeling of retribution, sure. But does it make them feel any safer? No, because often they live in the same neighborhoods and they've seen how many people go in and come back worse for it, not better. And they think about their next child who has to walk to that same store, who now is going to encounter someone who's now been away 3 or 5 years and is now back, no better for it. When we think about even just the drivers of violence, what researchers show as the drivers of violence, and Danielle Sered, who is she wrote a book, Until We Reckon. I highly recommend it. She's an amazing speaker on these issues, but she talks about this all the time. The 4 core drivers of violence are the same things that exist in our prison system. It's exposure to violence, it is separation, it's isolation from community and family, it's an inability to meet one's economic needs. All of those things exist exactly in the same environment we're supposed to put someone who's committed violence, and then we expect them to come home. I saw the chat. It is Until We Reckon. The author's name is Danielle Sered. And it is about our need to address it. That basically her premise is we will never address mass incarceration in this country until we address violence and do something different with violence. And so this is why I'm such a fan of restorative processes, because those truly are about centering the survivor and their needs and requiring the real accountability. We punish. You can go through our whole process, be convicted, be sentenced, and never actually reckon or have to even admit that you committed the crime. You can go do your time and say you'd be convicted at trial, always maintain that you were not guilty, go through your sentencing and do your time and never have to actually reckon with the harm that you did to someone. If we want accountability, these other processes are actually about promoting that accountability, requiring that accountability in ways that our system does not. So this, there's so much about this that I think people think when we talk about ending mass incarcerations that we're doing it to the detriment of victims. We actually aren't. We are doing detrimental harm to victims right now in the way that we operate. I think these other options actually center their needs and actually make us safer. That's the other thing. People want safety. And this, we know recidivism rates. We know that we send people away a long time and don't bring them home ready to do something different. It's amazing people like Sam who have support and mothers, but I'm sure Sam would admit, not everybody that he did time with has been on the same journey he's been on. Not everybody he did time with, he'd want living next door to him right now. You know, there's you have to almost find it on your own or have an amazing mama like Sam's who will bring it to you to help you on that journey, because our current system certainly doesn't help with that.
Or 3 points. One, calling law enforcement. The first time I was shot in my mother's backyard as a teenager in 1986, she called the police. They didn't show up. They didn't show up. My mother's a registered nurse, so she bandaged me up and we waited for the ambulance till she fell asleep. That's just to give you an example. In my mind, they didn't care. I want retribution. In terms of being able to speak to the people who you've harmed. And the Board of Parole hearings, so I went to the Board of Parole hearings 9 times. Here's the rule. When a person, the next of kin comes, you can't even look at them. They're sitting not even 2 feet from you at a table. And you can't turn and say, I'm sorry. You can't turn and say, I was wrong. You cannot speak to them, literally. And my board hearing, I just said, well, they're just gonna have to deny me in my mind because I have to say this. And I was denied and I got in trouble, but I didn't care because I wanted to convey to the father that I'm sorry, like, there's nothing I can do to change this, but I want you to know and see in my eyes that I mean this. And so that's the second thing. The last piece that, John, that, and I love this piece, and this is why we created the Hope and Redemption team. I have my mom to motivate and inspire me. I also had a daughter that was born a month after I was arrested. And these 2 amazing, powerful women were the reason why I changed. But everybody doesn't have that. And so we created the Hope and Redemption team. You can imagine people that are in maximum security prisons and all you see around you is violence and negativity. And then you see 7, 8, 9 guys in suits. The first thing, and we've often been mistaken for administration of prisons, and we sit down and we share that we're former life prisoners and we're here to show you a different way, that there is another life for you. There's hope created. There's instant credibility. And then when we tell them, like, we held ourselves accountable and this is something that you have to do this to return. And when we share this, it's a struggle for them. Like it has been, some of the guys that have come home from the first, when we first started this, I would never forget some of the guys that were like, this is bull. And then when they started going to the classes and they listened to us, they were like, you know what? You freed me of a burden. Now I'm willing to hold myself accountable because what I did was wrong. But you literally have mentors that have walked that path and now come in. And I know we do it here in California, we don't do it enough. We also don't do enough as far as being able to bring survivors and people who committed violent crimes together to be able to have that dialogue. We're doing it, but not enough. And like I said, California, we're doing it, but what about the rest of the nation? Especially southern states.
Right. That's a whole other conversation about the South. I want to, the work that I do, especially because I've walked in the shoes as a prosecutor, just listening to everything that you've both said, and the realities about victims in the system and how, everything that you sort of went through, Jami. I can imagine that any prosecutor that's listening to this conversation is feeling the following way. My whole life's work has been about the victims. I have, me personally, and I'm sure you have too, Jami, I have had cases where victims I know their names, I remember them, and I think that they would, and I'm honored to know that they would attribute my handling of that crime as to the reason that they were able to sort of get back on their feet, and we were able to get them great services. But I think that sometimes when prosecutors or law enforcement hear this conversation, they feel that all of the work that they've done has been for naught, that somehow that they're complicit, that it's not just about the car, but it's about the driver, and they're the driver, and so it's on them. And that the only thing that we're saying here is we got to tear the system down. This is an abolition conversation. And I try a lot to sort of try to unpack that and explain to the people that I work with that that's not what we're saying. We're raising issues and data and stats and the voices of people that maybe DAs and law enforcement haven't heard from. And so I want to go there. Is the direction abolition or not? I mean, I will start with you, Sam. I mean, are you an abolitionist? Is it a tear the system down? Or is there a place where we can actually be reaching out to law enforcement, to prosecutors, even prosecutors that aren't, quote unquote reform minded, but, and career prosecutors? Like, how does that conversation happen? I know that there are, 2,400 elected prosecutors across this country. The projections from the Sentencing Project are that it's going to take 75 years to be able to get our carceral footprint reduced. So logically, my perspective, we need everybody. And so how can we know all of the things that we know and say in the perspective that's been shared here, and also make sure that we are getting as many people to get involved in this movement as possible? How do those two things, how can those things coexist? And I'll start with you, Sam, and then I want to hear from Jami.
Okay, so thank you. Great question. First, I'm not an abolitionist, and I don't, and with all due respect to people that are abolitionists, I mean no disrespect. I don't believe in abolition, and I'll tell you why. I spent 24 years in prison, maximum security yards, and I came home, and I met people who I would never want to live next door to me. Some that are still inside. The vast majority of people I met that wanted to change, I want to see come home. That's 95, 96% of people that are in prison. I wouldn't mind living next door to them. But that 5% that I know, that I met, that I lived with for decades and watched, that's why I don't believe in abolition. I'm a reformer. And I believe reform can work, and we're doing it in California. And just to give you a few pieces of information, California at the height of its prison population had 178,000 people in prison and out of state. Today, the population is at about 93,000. We're slated to close the first prison in 30 years in California next year. We're closing all 3 Department of Juvenile Justice facilities, which are juvenile prisons in the state of California. These are all reforms. Like literally, we're watching as we passed, as an organization, ARC has co-sponsored, helped write, and advocate for the passage of 24 pieces of legislation, including ending life without the possibility of parole for juveniles and Miranda rights for juveniles. And so these are all incremental reforms, and some people don't believe in that. And I get it. Here's the thing. I'm literally sitting at my office in my home that my wife and I purchased in a cul-de-sac, where on the weekends we see kids running up and down the street, and the worst thing that they could worry about is falling off their bike. This is what we all want. I know men in prison, women in prison, people in prison want that too. They just don't know how to get there. Our system has to change and reform, because when people do things to harm other people, there has to be a level of accountability. And when they're held accountable, they also need the opportunity to heal and address their issues. Therapy. What happens if I robbed somebody and it turned into a murder because I didn't have a skill set where I could get a job to provide for my children? So not just therapy, but I also need education, trades. I need all of these things on the inside of the institution, so when I step out, I can provide for myself. I'm not a person who's looking to figure out how to hustle. And then you have to have robust re-entry services for people that are inside. If this doesn't work, answer me one question, and this is for any of our audience. 178,000 at the height, we're at 93,000, and that number is going down. The last thing I'll say is this. For life prisoners in California, for a long time, they were not released. In the last 9 years, life prisoners have been being released because both of the court's decision, but mainly because of the governor. 9,951 or so life prisoners have been released. This is the number, the recidivism rate. The first year, less than 1% recidivism. Third year, less than 3% recidivism. Lower than any other group. Not because they were life prisoners, but because in order for you to be released, you have to go through all of these programs and address your issues. And then you have to be able to verbally explain to the board what were the causative factors that made me make the decisions that I made. And this is how I've addressed them. And this is how I know I'll never commit a crime like that again.
There's thank you for all of that, Sam. There's some questions in the chat about ARC. So ARC, it's the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. If you want to drop the website into the chat for people, there's a lot of questions about, who are you and what do you do, and your day-to-day life besides the brilliance you have here. I want to open it up now to some of the questions and also kind of tie back. There's a question in the chat that we have here, and I want to take it to Jami, following up with what I was just saying about there's a reckoning that has to happen. We know that, and you've talked about that. So this is Cindy Lopez's question. How do you have a reckoning and bring along your former colleagues, Jami, my former colleagues, and everybody that needs to be part of this? It's an all hands on deck situation. We need everybody. How do we have a reckoning and still bring people along that might feel a certain way, a type of way about everything that's been said today?
I mean, I think one thing for me is that people need information, so I think I worked for a pretty good office because I was taught to do justice in each case. I wasn't taught to go get convictions, do justice. So if that case needed to be dismissed, there's some question about the evidence, then dismiss it. But even in an office where my mandate was to do justice every day, I never had the opportunity to zoom out and understand what my justice in each case approach meant for us as a country. I had no idea that we had a national crisis of mass incarceration. No idea that we incarcerate more than any other place on the planet. We have 5% of the world's population, nearly 25% of the world's incarcerated population, and that we're doing all of this in the name of safety. I also never really, as a prosecutor, you sort of think your job is you get the conviction, there's a sentencing, you close it off, it goes off the closed files. It wasn't really until my own brother had his own run-in. I'd had cousins who had system involvement, but my brother's like my person. And due to substance use disorder, he, like so many people, got caught up in the system. And seeing what it really meant to be behind bars and what he experienced and how none of it was to address the underlying issue, at all that got him there. Just let me know, like, this isn't working. Like, this is how we're doing things is not working. So I think a big part of it is that people just need to know, like, be able to see the forest and not just the trees, but then also have that historical context. So the other thing I didn't know is that there are other places in this world who also have incarceration, but who do it vastly differently than the way we do. We not only have the highest amount, we incarcerate longer than anyone else, we also incarcerate younger than anyone else. So there are places where you can see that incarceration truly is about rehabilitation. It is, let us figure out what happened. What is the underlying issue? How do we get you the therapy? How do we get you the training? How do we prepare you to come back home? 95% of our folks who go in are coming home. We just don't give them that support to prepare them to. So I really believe most, especially prosecutors, they didn't take the job because they're trying to make money. They certainly could have done that a different way. They didn't take the job. I've never been in a room, and I ask this question often about what brought you to this role, is no one ever said it's because I want to lock up as many Black and brown people as possible. They take it because they care about victims. They take it because they love their community. They want to be a public servant. They want to help. They care about the lofty ideals of justice and truth. But without an understanding, a deeper understanding of the ways that our failure as a country to ever reckon with our history, the influence of the legacy of slavery, white supremacy. It's not just white people. We are so ingrained in a culture of white supremacy. We all exhibit it. And that's why things like implicit racial bias are so real. You don't believe it, go take the test. You will take it and you will find, I don't care, black, brown, whoever, you will find your implicit racial bias against your own people. It is because it is in the air we breathe. So if you don't have that information, if you don't understand, all this context to just the everyday grind of trying to do justice in each case, then once you're exposed to that, I truly think for most prosecutors, then you understand the system is not aligning with the very values that brought you in it in the first place. And so we all have to work together to find better ways. And those ways exist. It is taking advantage of things like restorative practices. It is thinking about how do we increase diversion. But I will say intentionally, we have to do those things in ways that center racial equity. And so I will have done a disservice if I did not say to this audience to please check out our latest initiative, Motion for Justice. It's motionforjustice.org. The whole point of that initiative is how do you center racial equity in transforming the role of the prosecutor? And it is written not just for prosecutors, it is written for any citizens, advocates, activists who are engaging with their local leaders. And there are concrete action steps, each with a specific racial equity strategy, because even the good things, if we don't do it in a way that centers racial equity, will continue to promote the disproportions that we see.
Can I add one other thing, something that's unique, and I have to give a shout out to former Secretary of Corrections, Ralph Diaz in the Department of Correction in California. Many people don't know that he submitted over 300 names. That's not a lot, but this was the first time that any secretary used Penal Code 1170D to recall a sentence. And so basically what wardens would do is go through the C file and they say this person is doing everything right. They interview them, they interview the officers that see them all the time, and then they make a recommendation. Let's see if we can have this person released. And it goes to the county that they were convicted of. Like it's a long, deep process, and ultimately the Secretary of Corrections has to make the final call and send it back to the county. Here's where prosecutors in those counties can help. Stop opposing these 1170D releases. And the reason why I say that is correctional officers see you Monday through Sunday. 24 hours a day is documented what you do when you have a good day, when you have a bad day. You have captains on the yard. You have people, you have all kind of investigative agencies that say, you know what, this person is ready to be released. Why would you oppose the correctional system that's supposed to hold people inside that's telling you this person is ready to go? And literally this goes from from staff all the way up through the warden, and the warden sends it to the Secretary of Corrections, who sends the recommendation to the district attorney to either oppose or support. There's some DAs that have supported, but right now there are about 250 cases just stuck in court because DAs are opposing it. Why? Why would you do that if you know that you have someone who's been watched and observed, and they can verify and say, this person will not be a threat to our community?
I want to piggyback just on that, because I'll also do a disservice if I don't mention that in addition to that, in California, we've expanded 1170. And so not only can the director, the head of the prison in California make these recommendations, but DAs also can bring cases back to court. If they're, when they are presented, or when they are able to find folks that have a similar redemption story, or simply that the sentence is just unjust and excessive on its face. There are no exclusions. There are no carve-outs in either the CDCR initiated, the prison initiated, or DA initiated. So, this kind of ties back to where's the breakdown. If there are mechanisms in place, the history is here for everybody to be able to understand and make those connections. And so I hope that people that have tuned in today will go to the Motions for Justice and do a deeper dive and make some of these connections more real for yourself. And hopefully when you do, you will walk away with the similar feeling that I had, which is a deeper commitment and a deeper resolve to really change the way that the system is operating. I hope that people have heard about this and we haven't shut down conversations, but that we've opened them up, and that this is the beginning of many conversations. Like Jami said, and as I have said, I've walked in the shoes of law enforcement. I've made mistakes. I had a lot of blind spots, and the reckoning internally is a lot, but it's necessary. And again, we need as many people that are out there to join this work and to join this fight. There's a question in the chat about the website. So if you scroll up, or maybe you can give it again to folks, Jami, because it's important. I mean, it's like the history lesson everybody needs, to be able to also see very concrete things that can be happening right now. Well, I'll just read it. It's motionsforjustice.viera.org. So to keep it, it's very, very simple and easy to access. We are 1 minute to end here. And so thank you for everybody with the questions in the chat. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to them, but a question about the 13th Amendment and whether changing that, oh my gosh, this is a conversation that needs to happen. And I wish we could do it, but we can't do it in the next minute. We also can't get into the question around mental health, but as most people know, I mean, this is one of the main drivers of the sort of movement towards, and you can call it defund the police, or you can call it reallocating resources. Again, not getting too hung up on how we phrase things, but yes, how do we shift money and not put all of that on first responders when they're not actually, police officers aren't actually trained to be mental health professionals. And so that's a great question, and we could have a whole session just on that. But I wanted to just close out and just basically ask Sam and Jamila to close us out. And what is the one thing that for the students, we have a lot of students that have joined here, people that are in law school, what is the one thing that you'd like to leave them with in their journey to figuring out where they want to go with their careers? So starting with Sam and then ending with Jamila.
Can John go first? Like, I'm a fan and I'm like starstruck, just so you know.
No, y'all are too funny.
In the club, there's a long line. Yes.
No. When I think about young people, it gives me hope and inspiration. One of my favorite things is to go and talk to law students. And so what I say to young people is that we need you. We need your idealism. We need your hope. We need your belief. So many of us have been doing this too long. We're jaded. Can we really change? Can the system really be better? We're just not creative. We've been in it too long. We need you because you are the visionaries. You really are the way to the future. So we need your voice, we need your activism, like be involved and do it. So we are counting on you. That is my message to the young folks, please.
I must echo that what John said. So to young people that are in law school, whether you become a defense attorney or a prosecutor, remember to look for the good in people. People are not born bad. And understand that behind everything, there's a story. And to understand that people can change, especially young people. Like, let's not throw our kids away. Don't do that. And literally figure out ways to change our system to one that does hold a person accountable, but with healing and compassion. And to those who've lost loved ones to violent crime, know that at ARC, we do center people that have lost loved ones. We do not forget about the loss of life, because every human life is valuable, and we understand that. And our job is to make sure that people that come out of prison never commit another crime. We want to help them understand that there's a life to be lived that can be amazing, and you can give back to your community every day.
Wow.
Wow. Okay. This is incredible. Thank you so much. And thank you for everybody that tuned in today. Obviously, go and follow these folks and go look at their work and plug in. As Jami said, we need everybody. And again, we will be back after the election to continue on with this conversation. So Carlos, do you want to officially close us out?
Yes, thank you, everyone. A lot of you are asking for a recording, contact info. We will have a follow-up email with all of that information, as well as any resources that our panelists want to provide. And join us again for part 3, the final part of this series on November 10th. Hopefully we'll know the results of the election by then. And as soon as I close this out, you should receive a link to sign up for that third and final event. So thank you so much to all of you for all this wisdom. Stay safe out there.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.